On today's World Insight, a meeting halfway between China and the European Union and Friday's summit tackling the world economy stability, pandemic recovery, and the Ukraine crisis. The key takeaways from the summit.
So I would very much encourage this dialogue to continue with an ambition to develop a better and as much as possible common approach.
Here's our host, Tian.
Hello and welcome to World Insight. I'm Tian. Chinese President Xi Jinping met with the European Council President and the European Commission President via video link last week. At the top of the agenda were managing relations between China and the EU, how to bring stability to a battered world economy, and the conflict in Ukraine. So under the current complex and troubled global situation, how could China and the EU better engage in dialogue, deepen cooperation, and uphold multilateralism? I spoke to someone in the know, Danilo Türk, the former Slovenian president. He's also the president now of the political forum Club de Madrid. Let's take a listen. Mr. President, good to see you.
My pleasure.
China-EU summit just wrapped up. We read the readouts from both sides. It seems that both sides have quite clear ideas about what they try to do and how to achieve success.
Yeah, surely they have clear ideas, but also they need more dialogue. I think that those ideas are still quite far apart. It's important that this dialogue continues, and equally important how it continues. You see, this dialogue shouldn't turn into a kind of a dialogue of the deaf, when everybody is saying just what he or she thinks, and then there is no real rapprochement, bringing different views together or developing an approach that would really help. So I would very much encourage this dialogue to continue with an ambition to develop a better and as much as possible common approach.
What would you start if you were sitting in their chair?
Yeah, look, I think that the priorities are fairly obvious nowadays. I mean, we now see that the process of building a multipolar world is a complicated and difficult one. It will require a lot of work, a lot of political effort. And I don't want to go into the whole analysis, but the priorities, I think, are quite clear. First, let's take the sanctions on Russia. We have to know those are not sanctions approved by the United Nations Security Council, which would have no doubt about their legitimacy and wisdom. I mean, these are very, I should say, experimental sanctions. They are dealing with uncharted terrain. I mean, they are very wide and could create a lot of problems for global economy beyond the reasons why they were imposed. Now, of course, one can understand that sanctions were, in a way, an expected and natural consequence or reaction to the Russian military action, but we don't know how they will work in practice. And it is very important to avoid a spillover. I think that there were some elements of understanding of this both on the Chinese and on the European side. I think China has presented its position quite clearly, and I think that both sides are interested in avoiding a spillover of these sanctions into a global recession, into a global economic problem which everybody will suffer from, and where it will be very difficult to get out of recession or any other type of global economic problems. So I think that priority is clearly there, and there are further priorities which I can also identify if you wish, of course.
I am extremely interested, Mr. President.
Okay, very good. So I think that if one stays with the current situation around Ukraine, I think that both sides have to develop their idea of humanitarian cooperation, which was also discussed in the summit, further. I mean, there will be a need for humanitarian support, and it would be very important to figure out how China will participate in that. Obviously, European Union is very directly affected by humanitarian problems in Ukraine, and further cooperative arrangements with China would be really important, not only for the sake of humanitarian addressing the humanitarian needs, but also to demonstrate that political readiness and will for cooperation exists. Then the next thing is political settlement in Ukraine. We now appreciate the efforts of Turkey, which has helped us building the first rounds of talks between Russia and Ukraine, and that's very good. But not much progress has been achieved, and at some point there will be a need for a more collective approach. And again, China has offered its own participation in that in early March. I remember the statement of the foreign minister Wang Yi on 7 March when he spoke about the readiness of China to participate, however, in a collective.
Necessary. That's his word. I was at the press conference when he said this.
Yeah, sure. So that is the kind of question of how does one to organize this collective approach. Obviously, Security Council is one place, but that's a difficult place. Maybe there is a need to establish a kind of a more informal contact group of major actors in the international society who are interested in addressing the problem and finding a solution. And that would include, of course, European Union and major parties or major countries in the European Union, but also major countries in other parts of the world, in particular in Asia, China, India, and others who may have very valid proposals and valid ideas. So, I mean, search for political solution is another priority. And then, we should not forget the question of reconstruction of Ukraine. I mean, this is, of course, still too early to discuss, but one has to think about it. And I believe that, again, China will have something to offer in that context. China has done a lot on the Belt and Road Initiative before. Ukraine has already become a very important partner on the Belt and Road landscape and bilaterally. And I think that everybody in the world should be interested in having China involved in reconstruction. As I said, there is not much discussion about that as yet, but every war ends, and every war after ending requires reconstruction of the affected areas.
Mr. President, I want to thank you enormously for what you have just said about all the important directions that actually should be consulted by both sides and multiple sides afterwards. Let me put this thing into context about some of the things you just mentioned, sanctions. Let's talk about that first. Now,
yes,
we see the use of sanctions as weapons by, for example, the United States toward Russia or toward Iran or some other countries bilaterally. But now, of course, that practice seems to be used now in this case. Of course, this is a different thing because there's a war going on between Russia and Ukraine. But now, Mr. President, how do you see the use of sanctions, especially the impact, unpredictable ones, on the Europeans, when some analysts inside Europe already talking about self-inflicted economic recession?
Yeah, well, look, I speak from the standpoint of my own experience. I was president of the United Nations Sanctions Committee on Libya some 20 years ago. And as you know, those sanctions were imposed on Libya by the Security Council of the United Nations because of a terrorist act, Lockerbie bombing, in which 2 officials from Libya were implicated. So that was a sanctions system which was very clear and had a very good basis of legitimacy. It was imposed by the Security Council, which is an important factor because Security Council is the only international body that has full legitimacy for imposition of sanctions. And third, they were limited, they were targeted, they were very clear, I mean, in terms of what is to be achieved by sanctions and what are the measures that were adopted to achieve those effects. We don't have any of that in the current sanctions. They are much broader. They are not approved by the Security Council, and they are very unpredictable as far as the effects are concerned. So we have to be aware of the tricky nature, of the essentially risky nature of sanctions that we are witnessing now, and they may certainly backfire on the countries that have imposed them. And of course, we already see that in the trade with oil and in financial matters, there are effects which are not entirely predictable. I was reading in the Financial Times last Friday that the value of ruble has gone up. The currency effect has been remedied very quickly. I mean, according to that article in Financial Times. I don't know how long this effect will stay and what will happen in the future, but it shows the volatility and unpredictability at the level of global economy. And we have to be really very seriously concerned about that, because this affects everybody. That is why I keep repeating, well, we need really a serious substantive dialogue of things. We have to watch what is happening, what the effects are, and how one can really produce results. If United Nations is in the picture, I think that becomes easier. Right now, United Nations is not in the picture, and one has to think about that also.
One of the issues I have noticed by analysts is that the dialogues, conversations, and even policy consultations are becoming extremely emotional, which is totally against its purpose. Now, I'm not just talking about one side, but multiple sides. So how to avoid that, or how to make sure that is being contained to a certain level? On the one hand, of course, important to talk to your constituency about your insistence to the principles. But on the other hand, very important to do the real diplomacy.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure whether this emotional element can be completely removed. Let me give you my own emotional element. You see, I have the honorary doctorate of Kharkiv University, which is the second largest city in Ukraine and has an excellent university, which is about 200 years old. And it's really a great privilege for me to have become honorary doctor of that university. I love meeting students and professors of that university. And every day I'm thinking about military threats and attacks that have affected the city of Kharkiv, and very probably also students whom I consider my students also, and professors. So you see that an emotional element cannot be fully eliminated, especially not in Europe, where there are many connections which bind people together. And when you see military force being used, it is really terrible. Now, my first comment on this would be, look, the first conclusion that one has to make is, let us not resort to use of military force. And that's a kind of a general principle which should apply globally. And I'm happy to hear that China keeps emphasizing this, and this should be emphasized. Military means are not good solution to anything. And you know, they bring, among other things, hugely emotional reactions, and as a result of that, much more difficulty for diplomacy. Now, how to go beyond that? I think that the moment we see that there are elements of a possible agreement, we should throw our weight behind that possibility for an agreement. This, I think, is the main reason why the talks that Turkey has managed to start are so important. And I think that all international actors should be focusing on those talks in Dolmabahce, in Istanbul, to make sure that they move forward, towards an agreement. Because, you see, theoretically, generally, solutions are possible. Solutions are not unachievable. The important thing is now to rally the whole world behind the idea of solutions. And that will help overcoming the obstacles created by emotional reactions, and also that will make diplomacy more effective.
Now, Mr. President, we understand the realities on the ground between Russia and Ukraine. One is very determined to achieve the goals before the military operation began. And the other, of course, is having a prolonged war that is going to damage its realities and its future. So both are having very strong position. And therefore, many wonder how much will the peace negotiations really about peace, or is it only becoming complementary to what is not being obtained or cannot be obtained at the battleground?
Well, look, let us not speculate about the possibilities and impossibilities. I think another piece of wisdom.
I love that word, Mr. President, you just said. That's so important. Thank you so much, sir.
Yeah, well, look, there is a piece of wisdom again coming from China, which we all should hear, and that is that 3-foot deep ice is not does not happen in one day. The problems that led to the use of military force were long in coming. I mean, there are reasons that have been accumulating over the years. Which led to this military confrontation now, and we have to understand that. We have to understand that on the one hand, those reasons have been accumulating over a long period of time, but also that this accumulation has shown where the problems are. So, for example, when one talks about the future security system in Europe, or the future status of Ukraine within the security system of Europe, we have to look into the whole process of accumulation of reasons which led to the war which is now unfolding.
Yeah.
Now, again, I'm quoting something that was expressed by Foreign Minister of China, Wang Yi, when he was speaking about this long-term, sustainable and inclusive and balanced system of Europe. Now, I don't expect China to come with a formula for that. I mean, Europeans will have to work out that formula themselves. Right now, the important thing is to stop military conflict, to stop the war, and then seek political solutions which will provide a stable, peaceful, and prosperous Ukrainian status within European Union, and at the same time, a long and sustainable system of European security and peace, where Russia has to be, of course, one of the major actors. It has been so for more than 200 years now. And therefore, solutions can be not only visualized, not only imagined, but they can also be produced. And many of us will have to participate in that.
It seems that you're suggesting ceasefire through political negotiations.
Yes.
Reconstruction, while at the same time, the EU membership of Ukraine, and at the same time, the Europeans as a whole thinking about the future security mechanism of the continent. Is that what you're trying to say?
Yes, I only need to add one element to clarify or perhaps develop my earlier idea a little further. You see, when I mentioned the positioning of Ukraine within the European Union, that's something that has been discussed recently. But I would like to tell you that this is not a new discussion. When I was president and Slovenia presided the European Union, I went to Strasbourg to address the European Parliament. And in that speech, I spoke about the European perspective for Ukraine. Many parliamentarians at that time were not sure whether it makes sense to talk about that, but I was insisting. I said, look, Ukraine has to find a way towards membership of European Union. So that was in 2008, like 14 years ago. Now, in April 2008, 14 years ago, and there were many who were saying the same thing. Now, European Union obviously has very strict and serious standards, which Ukraine currently cannot satisfy. Therefore, we know that this is not going to happen overnight. Ukraine knows that too. And Russia, I know for sure, was not inimical to the idea of Ukrainian membership in the European Union, if that doesn't mean the membership in the military alliance, in NATO as well. So I think we have the parameters now. Obviously, it is very difficult to overcome the current emotional and stressful situation which that military conflict has created. But I think the contours of the solution have been established a long time ago. It's a pity that, let's say, back some 8 years ago, the idea of bringing Ukraine into the process of membership of European Union was not attempted seriously. and that, throughout the whole period, there was a linkage between NATO membership and EU membership. I think these two things have to be delinked now. They could have been delinked 8 years ago, and I'm sure that the war would be avoided if that happened 8 years ago. But we have no time machine. We cannot bring history back. What we can do now is really to delink these two things and find a formula which would put Ukraine on a credible path. I emphasize credible path towards European Union membership, not in a kind of a symbolic limbo where, then it lingers for decades waiting for progress. Now, this has to be done in a way which would show, okay, these are the steps which have to be taken in order to bring Ukraine into the European Union.
Mr. President, then the question about whether the European continent will be able, particularly the EU, be able to make its own independent decisions, given the ever-evolving geopolitical situation of the world, about what its future needs to be like and how to make that decision happen. Mr. President, what's your idea about what's going on?
I think that all the observers of the last summit of EU and China have noticed the emphasis that President Xi made on the need for an independent policy making of European Union. This is logically not alien to European Union because European Union has declared its role as an actor in geopolitics. All right, now being actor in geopolitics requires a degree of independence of political decision making. The idea of European Union being a geopolitical actor requires a degree of independence in its political decision making. That degree does not exist now, and there are reasons for that. I mean, there is a war, and of course there is a lot of transatlantic solidarity, which is natural and expected. But then again, the transatlantic solidarity is not the whole picture. European Union should also be able, in addition to that, develop its policies which are independent. Now, you see, it was said in the past, in the statements of European Union leaders, that the needs and the interests of European Union vis-à-vis China are similar, but not identical with those of the United States. Now, you see, being similar and not identical opens a space which has to be explored further, including in matters such as the comprehensive agreement on investments, which which is now frozen, but should be kept under discussion. Now, I believe that we have to have a very serious dialogue in all directions from the European Union perspective. I mean, with China, with the United States, and with others, because I believe that the common platform is the need for developing a peaceful world, a prosperous and peaceful world. And in order to have that, European Union shouldn't deprive itself of the capacity to develop solutions, to develop arrangements with China on its own. It doesn't have to have, the US protection for that. And that is something that is not going to come easily and quickly. And for that reason, I believe we need a kind of a continuous dialogue, particularly between EU and China, continuous, not just, summits once in 2 years, but something much more frequent and at all levels. And then obviously, equally, European Union will have to have a dialogue with the United States and see how best to coordinate activities on matters where European Union and US interests are similar but not identical. And I was emphasized, not identical. We have to figure out what our needs are, what our interests are, and then develop system which would, ideally satisfy everybody.
Many say this is an era of 礼崩乐坏. That is, of course, in Chinese, meaning all the earlier agreed consensus and principles and ideas and standards are now being severely challenged. And people are trying to promote the thought that the rules of the jungle is the rule of today. Now, Mr. President, you serve in a geographically small European country, which of course needs international rule, needs international. Also, you are also served in the United Nations. You know how important to bring the consensus together. What do you make of what we are experiencing right now? Are we in a Cold War, a quasi-Cold War, Cold War 2.0, or whatever? People give names to it. What is the name you want to give? Where are we?
Yeah, I would. Well, I would not give a name which would last for a long time. I say we are in a very dangerous situation right now. Things can go out of hand. Things can spill over into a third world war. We are really in a very dangerous situation. And in such a situation, it's important to recall the historic wisdom of the Charter of the United Nations. The Charter is not only a treaty, it's a concentrated wisdom of human history. And the principles of the United Nations are something so precious that they have to be upheld even in a dangerous situation like this. And ways need to be found for that to happen. The Secretary General of the United Nations has recently appointed an advisory board, of which I am a member, incidentally, an advisory board on effective multilateralism. And obviously, we have to make a huge effort now to bring the international developments in the framework which is defined in the Article 2 of the Charter of the United Nations, the basic principles of the United Nations: non-use of force, peaceful settlement of disputes, non-interference in internal affairs of states, and working together with the United Nations. I mean, these are the kind of principles which did not appear as a result of some kind of an academic exercise. They are concentrated experience of hundreds of years of human history. They are so precious that we have to make every effort. Nothing should be too expensive to do to preserve them. And obviously there are ways of doing it. I mean, the dialogue between European Union and China is an instrument of that. And I think that this dialogue should be made continuous and should be intensified, because it's a very important ingredient in the whole picture. And there are, of course, many other things that need to be done, including at the level of the United Nations. I see a possibility of the world sliding into a kind of a world war of some kind of, as a real threat. But there are ways out, and those ways have to be found.
My conversation with Danilo Türk, the former Slovenian president and now president of Club de Madrid. That's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to know more, search World Insight or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei on behalf of the team. Thanks for being with us. Bye for now.